The rain fell in relentless sheets, hammering against the sleek black sports car as it sped down the empty highway. Ethan Lawson, a billionaire known for his ruthless business strategies and cold demeanor, tightened his grip on the wheel. The windshield wipers worked furiously, but visibility was almost non-existent. It had been another long, exhausting day, another day spent drowning in numbers, contracts, and lifeless boardroom discussions, another night spent avoiding the deafening silence of his penthouse, an echo of the life he had built. He told himself this was the price of success. Yet, as he drove through the storm, his mind drifted to memories he had long buried. Rachel. Her laughter once filled every empty space in his heart. Her presence once softened the sharp edges of his ambition. But now, she was nothing more than a memory, one he never allowed himself to revisit. It had been 10 years since she had passed away. 10 years since he last saw her smile. A deep ache twisted in his chest as he stole a glance at the faded photograph in the passenger seat. Rachel, caught mid-laugh, her curls dancing in the wind. He had promised her the world. But in the end, he had given her nothing but loneliness. He clenched his jaw. This is why love was dangerous. Ethan reached for the radio, hoping to drown out his thoughts. The soft hum of old jazz music filled the car, a tune Rachel used to hum while making coffee. A sharp pang of regret stabbed through him. He turned the dial to switch stations but hesitated. That single moment of distraction cost him everything. The world tilted violently as the tires skidded on the wet pavement. His heart slammed against his ribs as he fought to regain control. But the car spun out of control. Headlights flashed wildly in the darkness. A sickening crunch echoed through the night as metal twisted against metal. Impact. Ethan barely registered the pain as the car crashed through the guardrail, tumbling down a steep ravine. A deafening silence followed. Then, the scent of smoke, gasoline. His head lolled to the side, his vision blurring. His body was pinned, trapped beneath the crumpled wreckage. A sharp pain pierced his ribs with every shallow breath. He tried to move, but agony stole his strength. This was it. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the cold fingers of fear wrap around his throat. He was going to die here, alone, forgotten. Then, through the ringing in his ears, he heard something. A voice. Urgent, sharp, panicked. Hey, can you hear me? His eyelids fluttered open. The world spun. He could barely make out the small figure scrambling toward the wreck. Hold on. The voice, though young, carried an authority that demanded attention. I'm getting you out of there. Ethan tried to speak, but only a ragged wheeze escaped his lips. The figure, a girl, no older than 15, grabbed at the crushed door, yanking with all her might. Damn it, she muttered, her small hands slipping on the rain-slicked metal. Ethan's consciousness wavered. He wanted to tell her to run, to save herself before the leaking gasoline ignited. But he couldn't force the words out. She wasn't leaving. Determined, she wedged a piece of metal under the door and threw her full weight into it. The door groaned before finally giving way. The effort cost her. She stumbled back, gasping for breath, but recovered in seconds. Come on, move, she ordered, reaching for him. Ethan gritted his teeth as she hauled him out just as the first flames licked the wreckage. A deafening explosion roared behind them. The force knocked them both to the ground. Ethan landed hard, pain flaring through his broken ribs. The girl coughed, covered in mud and debris, but alive. His vision flickered. The world darkened. The last thing he saw before slipping into unconsciousness was her face, determined, defiant, and strong. Then, darkness. Ethan stirred, his body heavy, every nerve screaming in protest. A dim, flickering light swayed overhead. The scent of damp wood and faint antiseptic filled the air. He wasn't in a hospital. He forced his eyes open, blinking against the fog in his mind. The same girl sat cross-legged on a battered chair nearby, watching him with a guarded expression. He struggled to sit up. Pain flared through his ribs, pulling a sharp hiss from his lips. The girl's eyes narrowed. You shouldn't move too much. You took a pretty nasty hit. His throat was dry. Where? You're safe, she said, arms crossed. You'd be dead if I hadn't pulled you out. He studied her. She couldn't have been more than 15 or 16. Her dark hair falling in uneven waves. Her clothes were worn and threadbare. Her sneakers caked in mud. Something about her felt familiar. His gaze shifted to her hands. a faint shimmer of silver. His heart stopped. Dangling from a thin chain around her neck was a simple, elegant ring. His stomach twisted as he recognized the engraving on the band. Rachel's name. His breath hitched. His pulse pounded. "Where did you get that?" His voice came out sharper than intended. The girl's hand shot up, instinctively gripping the ring. Her entire posture turned defensive. "It's mine," she snapped. "I've had it forever." Ethan's chest tightened. That was impossible. Rachel had never taken that ring off. His mind reeled. Who was this girl? Why did she have the one thing that should have been buried with his wife? A million questions clawed at his brain. But one stood out above the rest. What if she wasn't a stranger at all? Ethan's breath hitched as he stared at the delicate silver ring dangling from the girl's neck. The dim light of the small room made the engraved name shimmer, Rachel Lawson. His wife's name. His dead wife's name. His heart pounded, drowning out the rain still drumming softly against the window. His ribs ached, his body screaming in protest from the accident. But the pain was nothing compared to the storm raging inside him. This was impossible. That ring should have been buried with Rachel. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, his voice hoarse but sharp. The girl, Sarah, snapped her head up, her fingers immediately wrapping around the ring as if shielding it from him. Her dark eyes, so wary and guarded, locked onto his. "It's mine," she said, her voice steady but defensive. "I've had it for as long as I can remember." Ethan's breath grew shallow. That wasn't an answer. That wasn't possible. "That ring," he said carefully, trying to control the rising wave of emotions threatening to choke him, "belonged to my wife." Sarah's expression flickered, just for a moment. A crack in the armor. But then she squared her shoulders, her chin lifting slightly in defiance. "You must be mistaken," she muttered, looking away. Ethan tried to sit up, but the sharp stab of pain in his ribs sent him collapsing back onto the thin mattress. He gritted his teeth, pushing through the dizziness, his mind refusing to let go of this impossible revelation. "My wife never took that ring off," he said, his voice lower, more deliberate. "The only way you could have it is if..." He stopped. If what? If Rachel had given it away? If Sarah had stolen it? If Rachel had a child he never knew about? The thought hit him like a gut punch. His fingers curled into fists against the sheets. No, that couldn't be. But the girl in front of him, with her wary eyes and stubborn set of her jaw, she looked like someone he used to know. Rachel. Could it be possible? Sarah exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders as if she was growing tired of the conversation. "Look," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "I don't know who you are or why you care so much about this stupid ring. But it doesn't mean anything. It means everything." Ethan shot back. Sarah flinched at the intensity in his voice but didn't break eye contact. The silence between them stretched tight, thick with unspoken truths. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, trying to make sense of the impossible. Rachel never told him about a child. And if she had hidden something this big from him, why? He needed answers. And the only person who had them was the girl standing in front of him. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, his voice softer this time, less demanding, more searching. Sarah hesitated. She didn't know. She didn't know who she really was. She had spent her entire life drifting from one temporary home to another. No real family, no real past, just fragments, whispers of memories that never quite fit together. The ring was the only thing she had, the only proof that she had come from somewhere. She had held onto it, believing that one day she might find the answers she needed. But those answers had never come. Until now. Her pulse quickened as she studied the man in front of her. Ethan Lawson. She knew who he was. Everyone did. A billionaire. A business tycoon. A man who had built an empire with nothing but ambition and steel in his veins. But the way he was looking at her now, asterisk with something close to desperation. Maybe even hope, asterisk felt different. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked, crossing her arms over her chest. Ethan let out a slow breath, his fingers rubbing his temples. "The truth," he admitted, "and I think you do too." Sarah swallowed hard. She did, more than anything. But the truth could be dangerous. Because if this man was telling the truth, if he really knew the person whose name was engraved on her ring, then everything she thought she knew about herself was a lie. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for that. Ethan stayed in Sarah's small, rundown apartment for 3 days. He had nowhere else to go. His phone had been destroyed in the crash, and the hospital was miles away. But none of that mattered. He needed time. Time to understand the impossible truth sitting in front of him. Sarah, despite her initial resistance, let him stay. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe she wanted answers just as much as he did. She was different than anyone Ethan had ever met. Tough, independent, guarded, a survivor. And yet, there was something familiar about her. The way she furrowed her brows when she was thinking. The way she held herself. Strong even when she was unsure. Rachel used to do the same thing. The thought haunted him. Late one night, Ethan sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the ring in Sarah's hand. The storm outside had finally calmed, leaving only the sound of dripping water from the leaky ceiling. "You remind me of her," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah stilled. She knew he meant Rachel. Her fingers curled around the ring, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Tell me about her," she said before she could stop herself. Ethan looked at her, something raw in his gaze. And then, for the first time in 10 years, he spoke about Rachel. The way she laughed. The way she hated black coffee but always drank it anyway. The way she had made the coldest rooms feel warm just by being in them. Sarah listened. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she was hearing echoes of something she had lost before she even knew she had it. 2 days later, Ethan found himself staring at an envelope. Inside was the answer to the question that had been haunting him since the moment he saw that ring. The DNA test. Sarah sat across from him, her expression unreadable. Ethan took a deep breath and opened it. His heart nearly stopped. 99.9% match. The paper trembled in his grip. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes shining with something between shock and overwhelming relief. "You're her daughter," he whispered. Sarah felt the world tilt. It didn't feel real. It couldn't be real. I don't," she stammered, her breath coming in short gasps. Ethan reached across the table, his grip firm but gentle. "You're not alone, Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You never were." Sarah felt something inside her shatter. For years, she had told herself she didn't need anyone, that she was fine on her own. But in that moment, asterisk in the way Ethan looked at her. Not as a stranger but as someone who belonged, asterisk, she realized something. She wasn't just a girl with a ring. She was Rachel's daughter. And maybe, just maybe, she had a family after all. If you found out your entire life was a lie, how would you react? Tell us in the comments. Did this story move you? Show your support by hitting like. Want more heart-touching stories? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Sarah sat frozen, her breath shallow as the weight of Ethan's words settled over her. "You're Rachel's daughter." The words felt distant, like an echo from another life, someone else's life. But they weren't. She was Rachel's daughter. Ethan was still staring at her, the DNA test results trembling in his hands. The dim light in the small apartment cast long shadows over his face. But his eyes, his piercing, storm-filled eyes, were locked onto hers, searching. Sarah's fingers curled around the chain of her necklace, gripping the ring so tightly it left an imprint on her palm. How could this be real? She had spent her entire life convinced she was unwanted, forgotten, a nameless girl drifting from one foster home to another, never truly belonging anywhere. But now, in the span of just a few days, everything had changed. She wasn't just Sarah. She was Rachel's child. And Ethan, this powerful, wealthy man who had been a stranger only days ago, was suddenly the closest thing she had to family. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Anger, confusion, grief, hope. No, she couldn't afford hope. Hope had betrayed her too many times before. She pushed back her chair abruptly, the legs scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "This doesn't change anything," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Ethan flinched, but his gaze never wavered. "Sarah, no," she cut him off, shaking her head as she stood, her hands balled into fists at her sides, as if bracing herself against a storm only she could see. "I don't know what you want from me. But I don't need you. I don't need a family. I never did." Ethan slowly set the test results down, exhaling through his nose. "You don't believe that," he said quietly. Sarah's jaw clenched. "You don't know me." "You're right," Ethan admitted, nodding slightly. "I don't, but I knew your mother." Sarah's stomach twisted painfully. She didn't want to hear about Rachel. Not now. Not ever. Because if she let herself listen, if she let herself care, then she would have to acknowledge everything she had lost before she even knew it existed. And that would break her. But Ethan wasn't giving up. Rachel loved you, he said, his voice laced with something raw and unfiltered. Whatever happened, whatever made her give you up, it wasn't because she didn't want you. Sarah let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Right, she scoffed, crossing her arms, because nothing says love like abandoning your child. Ethan flinched, but this time, there was something else in his expression. Guilt, regret, like he understood something she didn't. And that terrified her, because if there was more to this story, if Rachel hadn't simply tossed her aside like unwanted baggage, then Sarah had spent her entire life believing a lie. And she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to face the truth. Ethan didn't push her, not at first. He stayed. That was the strangest part. He stayed. Every day, he sat at the tiny kitchen table, nursing a cup of terrible instant coffee. Waiting. He didn't ask questions. He didn't force conversations. But his presence was undeniable. It was infuriating. Sarah had spent her entire life being disposable. She had learned early that people didn't stick around. Not foster parents. Not caseworkers. Not even the other kids in the system who swore they'd be family forever, before vanishing into different homes. Different lives. She was used to being forgotten. So why wouldn't Ethan leave? What did he see in her that was worth staying for? One night, as she stood by the window, staring at the city lights beyond the cracked glass, she finally spoke. You really knew her? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked up from his book, startled by the sudden question. Rachel? He asked, setting the book down. Sarah nodded, swallowing hard. The silence stretched between them for a moment before Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. She was everything, he admitted. Smart, stubborn, the kind of person who made you feel like you mattered just by standing next to her. Sarah's fingers curled against the windowsill. She had never mattered to anyone. Ethan looked down at his hands, as if searching for the right words. She had a way of making the world feel warmer. He continued, even on the worst days. I loved her. The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Loved her. Past tense. Sarah took a shaky breath. Then why did she leave me? She whispered. Ethan's eyes darkened with something unreadable. I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely audible, but I'm going to find out. 2 days later, Ethan made a phone call. Sarah didn't know who he had called. She only knew that his entire demeanor had changed after that. There was a fire in his eyes, a determination she hadn't seen before. And that scared her, because if he was right, if there was more to this story than she had ever been told, then she had spent her entire life hating the wrong person. And she didn't know how to live with that. Ethan didn't tell her much. Only that they were leaving. Where? Sarah had asked, crossing her arms. To find answers, Ethan said simply. Sarah wanted to argue. She wanted to refuse. But deep down, she knew she wouldn't. Because the truth, no matter how painful it might be, was something she could no longer ignore. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone in searching for it. Sarah didn't know how long she had been sitting there, staring at the file on the table. The words blurred together, her mind refusing to fully process what was in front of her. Ethan sat across from her, his sharp yet sorrowful gaze fixed on her. He had found the truth they had been searching for, and it was far more painful than Sarah had ever imagined. Your mother didn't abandon you, Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. She fought to keep you. Sarah swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. No, it couldn't be. She had spent her entire life believing she was unwanted. A mistake, a burden that her mother had chosen to discard. But now, Ethan was telling her that her entire life had been a lie. I don't believe you, she whispered, but her voice trembled. If she loved me, she wouldn't have left me. Ethan slid the file toward her. Read it yourself. Sarah hesitated before slowly turning the pages, her hands shaking. And there it was. Letters from Rachel, pleading with the authorities not to take her baby away. Documents proving that someone had forced her mother to give her up. Recordings of a social worker, confirming that Rachel had fought with everything she had, and still lost. Sarah's breath hitched. Her mother had loved her. Her mother had wanted her. But someone had stolen everything from them. Tears welled in her eyes. Hot and unstoppable. Ethan said nothing. He didn't need to. The truth was right in front of her. Sarah couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned all night. Her mind a raging storm. Who did this? Who tore her mother away from her? By the time morning arrived, Sarah stepped into the living room to find Ethan already waiting. He looked as if he had been awake all night too. His jaw clenched as he spoke. I know who did this. Sarah froze, her heart pounding. Who? She whispered, her voice hoarse. Ethan locked eyes with her, his expression dark and resolute. Victoria. Sarah went completely still. Victoria. That name. She had seen it before. In the documents. In the letters. Victoria was the one who had forced Rachel to give her up. Victoria was the one who had destroyed their lives. Sarah's hands balled into fists. Rage bubbling inside her. Where is she? She asked. Her voice cold as ice. Ethan exhaled slowly. She's still alive. Sarah's breath caught. She's still alive. The woman who had stolen her mother from her, the woman who had let her grow up believing she was unwanted, was still breathing. And now, Sarah had the truth. Now, she had a chance to face the woman who had ruined everything. Ethan drove, while Sarah sat in silence, her knuckles white from gripping her hands too tightly. They arrived at an old apartment building. Victoria lived here. Sarah stepped out of the car. Her heart pounded. Then the door opened. Victoria. She was older than Sarah had imagined. Wrinkled, frail, but her sharp, calculating eyes were still the same. So, Victoria said, a thin smile curling on her lips. You finally came. Sarah's jaw tightened. What did you do to my mother? Victoria sighed, leaning against the doorframe. I did what had to be done. What had to be done? Sarah's voice shook with fury. You ruined her life. You stole me from her. Victoria simply shrugged. Rachel was foolish. She chose love over status. I only made the right decision for her. Sarah clenched her fists so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. Do you even understand what you did? She whispered, her voice filled with raw pain. You made me believe my mother didn't love me. You let me grow up full of hate. Victoria didn't speak. She didn't need to. She knew she had lost. Sarah shook her head, tears spilling down her face. I will never forgive you. Then, she turned around and walked away. For the first time in her life, she felt free. After the confrontation, Sarah didn't know what to feel. Anger? Relief? Emptiness? Ethan sat beside her, watching her with quiet understanding. What will you do now? He asked. Sarah took a deep breath. Then, she looked up at the sky. The golden hues of the sunset painting everything in warm light. I'm going to live, she said, a soft smile forming. For the first time in her life, she wasn't trapped by the past. For the first time, she could move forward without fear. What would you do if you discovered your entire life was a lie? Leave a comment to support Sarah. Do you feel for Sarah? Hit like to encourage her. Want more emotional and gripping stories? Subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. The air was thick with tension. Sarah sat motionless, the folder in her hands trembling slightly. She had spent years wondering about the truth, about why her mother had abandoned her, why she had been left to struggle alone. And now, in this very moment, she was staring at the answer. Ethan sat across from her, his sharp eyes watching her carefully. He had always been steady, calm under pressure, but even he couldn't hide the storm brewing beneath his expression. Sarah, he said softly, are you okay? She wasn't. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she slowly turned the pages of the documents Ethan had placed in front of her. Letters, court orders, witness statements. Each piece of paper carried a piece of her past, one she had never been allowed to see. And then, there it was, a faded photograph tucked between the pages. Sarah lifted it with shaking hands. It was a picture of a young woman, her dark curls cascading over her shoulders, her eyes filled with warmth and sorrow. The woman in the photograph was Rachel, her mother. Tears burned at the edges of Sarah's vision. She had imagined her mother countless times, wondering if she was cruel, heartless, uncaring. But the woman in this picture didn't look like a monster. She looked like someone who had loved deeply, someone who had lost everything. Her fingers traced the worn edges of the photo. She fought for me, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. Ethan nodded, his expression heavy with grief. Yes, She never wanted to give you up. Sarah's chest ached, a deep, unbearable pain spreading through her body. All these years, she had hated her mother, resented her, but Rachel had never abandoned her. Someone else had taken her away. Sarah clenched her jaw, anger rising inside her. "Who did this?" she asked, her voice shaking with fury. Ethan hesitated before answering. "Victoria." Sarah's breath caught. The name sent a chill down her spine. Victoria. She had seen it before. Buried deep within the documents. Written in the margins of official papers. Victoria had orchestrated everything. She had forced Rachel to give Sarah up. She had destroyed their family. Sarah's hands trembled as she clenched them into fists. Where is she now? Ethan exhaled sharply. Still alive. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The woman who had stolen everything from her was still out there. Still breathing. Still living her life as if nothing had happened. A fire ignited inside Sarah, a fierce, burning determination. She needed answers. She needed to face Victoria. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit apartment. Sarah stepped inside, her pulse racing. And then, she saw her. Victoria. She sat in an old armchair. Her frame frail but her eyes as sharp as ever. She looked up slowly, her lips curling into a knowing smile. "So," she murmured, "you finally found me." Sarah's chest tightened. This was the woman who had stolen her childhood. Who had made her believe she was unwanted. Sarah's voice was ice. "What did you do to my mother?" Victoria sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I did what was necessary." Sarah's fists clenched. "Necessary? You tore us apart. You ruined her life. You ruined mine." Victoria gave her a long, assessing look. Rachel was weak. She didn't understand the way the world worked. She chose love over power. And she paid the price. Sarah felt rage unlike anything she had ever known. "She was my mother," she hissed, her voice shaking. "And you took her from me." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. "She made her choice. I made mine. She didn't have a choice." Sarah shouted. "You forced her to give me up. You destroyed her." For the first time, something flickered in Victoria's expression. Guilt? Regret? But it was gone in an instant. "And yet, here you are," Victoria said, her voice smooth, "standing in front of me. Stronger than she ever was." Sarah shook her head, disgust rolling through her. "You don't get to twist this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You stole my life. You stole hers. And for what?" Victoria was silent. For the first time, she had nothing to say. Sarah took a deep breath, her hands still trembling. "I will never forgive you," she whispered. And with that, she turned and walked away, free for the first time in her life. Back at the house, Sarah sat in silence, staring at the sky. Ethan sat beside her, waiting. Finally, she spoke. "I don't know what to do now." Ethan's voice was soft. "Live." Sarah looked at him, searching his face. "Live?" she repeated. "Yes," Ethan said, a small smile on his lips. "Live for yourself, for your mother, for the life that was stolen from you. Move forward, Sarah. That's the only way you win." Sarah inhaled deeply, letting his words sink in. And for the first time, she realized she was free to choose her own future. Not Victoria. Not the past. Her. Sarah closed her eyes, allowing the weight of it all to settle. She wasn't trapped anymore. She wasn't just a victim. She was stronger than her past. Stronger than Victoria. And she would never let anyone take her power again. The streets were cold that night. Colder than usual. Sarah pulled her coat tightly around her thin frame as she hurried down the sidewalk. Her heart pounded, her breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. She had spent years searching for answers, but nothing had prepared her for what she was about to find. At the corner of a dimly lit street, she finally saw her. Victoria. The woman who had stolen her childhood. The woman who had torn her away from her mother. But she wasn't the powerful, untouchable figure Sarah had imagined all these years. She was a broken shell of herself, her once perfectly styled hair now unkempt. Her sharp eyes dulled with exhaustion. She sat on the steps of an old building, wrapped in a tattered coat, staring blankly at the street ahead. Sarah's throat tightened. This was the woman who had caused her so much pain. And yet, looking at her now, all she felt was sadness. She took a deep breath, her footsteps hesitant as she approached. Victoria. The name hung in the air between them like a ghost from the past. Slowly, Victoria lifted her gaze, squinting in the dim light. When her tired eyes finally focused on Sarah, something flickered in them: shock, recognition, and something else: fear. Victoria shifted uncomfortably, her hands tightening around the thin fabric of her coat. "So," she said, her voice hoarse from the cold, "you found me." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "I had to." Victoria let out a bitter laugh. "And now what? You want revenge? You want to scream at me? Tell me how much you hate me." Sarah's fingers curled into fists at her sides. She had rehearsed this moment in her head 1,000 times, imagined every cruel thing she could say to this woman who had stolen her life. But now that she was standing in front of her, it didn't feel that simple. "I just want the truth." Victoria studied her for a long moment, then sighed, her shoulders slumping. "The truth won't change anything." "Maybe not," Sarah said, "but I deserve to know." Victoria hesitated, but something in Sarah's voice, the quiet strength, the determination, seemed to break through whatever walls she had left. She looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your mother, Rachel, she never wanted to give you up." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Then why did she?" Victoria exhaled shakily, her hands trembling. "Because I forced her to." The words sliced through the air like a knife. Sarah took a step back, her chest tightening. "Why?" she whispered. Victoria closed her eyes, pain flickering across her face. "Because she loved someone she wasn't supposed to. Because she refused to marry the man her family had chosen. Because she was too kind, too naive to see the danger she was in." Sarah's heart ached. "And you thought taking me away from her would fix that?" Victoria nodded slowly. "I thought, if she lost you, she would come back, that she would finally listen. But she didn't. She fought me. She fought until the very end." Sarah's eyes burned with unshed tears. She had spent her entire life believing she had been abandoned, that her mother hadn't wanted her. But the truth was the opposite. Her mother had fought for her, and she had lost everything because of it. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Victoria looked up, her gaze filled with something Sarah had never expected to see: regret. "I thought I was protecting her," she whispered, "but I was only destroying her." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. This was the moment. This was the choice she had to make. She could let the anger consume her, could tell Victoria she was a monster, that she deserved to be alone and suffering. Or she could choose something else. Something harder. Forgiveness. Sarah took a shaky breath, then reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to Victoria. Victoria hesitated before taking it. "What is this?" Sarah's voice was steady. "An address. A place where you can get help." Victoria stared at her in disbelief. "Why would you do this?" Sarah met her gaze, her voice filled with quiet strength. "Because my mother wouldn't want me to become like you." For the first time, Victoria's walls crumbled, her lips trembled, her eyes shining with something Sarah had never seen before: tears. She gripped the paper tightly, her shoulders shaking. I don't deserve this." Sarah gave her a small, sad smile. "Maybe not, but you still have a choice." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the past behind her. Later that night, Sarah sat in her apartment, staring at the picture of her mother. Her heart still ached, but it was a different kind of pain now. It was a pain that could heal. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel lost. She felt free. She had faced her past. She had chosen to move forward. And that was what real strength looked like. What would you have done in Sarah's place? Could you have forgiven Victoria? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you believe in the power of forgiveness, hit like to show your support for Sarah's journey. Don't miss the next heartwarming story. Subscribe now for more. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and coffee that had long since gone cold. Jack sat in one of the hard plastic chairs, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The rhythmic beeping of heart monitors echoed from the hallways, a painful reminder of where he was. In a hospital, waiting for his daughter. His daughter. The words felt foreign in his mind. He had spent years building a business empire, believing success meant power, wealth, and control. Yet here he was, powerless, praying for the life of a little girl he had only just met. Sophie, a fragile child with his eyes. His daughter, his flesh and blood. And he had failed her before he even knew she existed. Jack clenched his jaw, his mind spinning with regret. He had been so blinded by ambition, so consumed with his own desires, that he had never considered the consequences of walking away from Sarah. He thought she would move on, thought she would be better off without him. But she wasn't alone when he left. She had been carrying his child. And now, that child was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. Jack exhaled shakily, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had never been afraid of anything in his life. Not hostile boardrooms, not business rivals, not even the constant pressure of being at the top. But this terrified him. A soft movement caught his attention. Sarah. She stood across the waiting room, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale with exhaustion. Her eyes, those same green eyes that had once looked at him with love, now held nothing but guarded pain. Jack wanted to say something, to tell her he was sorry, to tell her he would give up everything, his company, his fortune, his entire world, if it meant Sophie would be okay. But what right did he have? What right did he have to stand here and pretend to be a father now? When he had spent years ignoring the possibility of fatherhood, Sarah finally met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then, in a voice so soft it nearly broke him, she whispered, "She's asking for you." Jack's breath caught in his throat. Sophie was awake, and she wanted him. Jack stood at the doorway of Sophie's hospital room, his hands trembling at his sides. She looked so small in that bed, hooked up to wires and machines that beeped in a steady rhythm. Her tiny fingers clutched a stuffed bear, her dark eyes flickering open when she heard the door creak. "Hi," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack swallowed the lump in his throat and stepped closer. "Hey, sweetheart, sweetheart." The word felt unfamiliar on his tongue. But when Sophie smiled, just the tiniest, sleepiest smile, he knew he had said the right thing. She shifted slightly, her frail body barely making an indent in the sheets. "Are you really my dad?" Jack's heart clenched. How could he answer that? How could he explain the years he had wasted? The birthdays he had missed? The moments he would never get back? But Sophie didn't want excuses. She didn't need explanations. She needed the truth. Jack slowly lowered himself onto the chair beside her bed. "Yes, I am." Sophie studied him for a long moment, then asked, "Where were you?" The question was like a dagger to his chest. Jack ran a hand over his face, exhaling shakily. "I didn't know about you, Sophie. If I had." He paused, shaking his head. "I would have been here. I swear to you, I would have been here." Sophie didn't say anything for a moment. Then, to his surprise, she reached out a small, weak hand toward him. Jack hesitated for only a second before taking it gently in his own. It was the smallest of gestures, a simple touch. But to Jack, it was everything, because it meant she wasn't pushing him away. She was letting him in. Jack didn't leave the hospital. Not for meetings, not for phone calls, not even when his assistant begged him to handle the crisis brewing at his company. Nothing else mattered. Sarah watched him with quiet suspicion at first. She had every reason to doubt him, every reason to think he would get bored and disappear. But he didn't. Jack was there when Sophie woke up crying in the middle of the night. He held her tiny hand through every painful injection. He learned how to help her sit up, how to adjust her pillows, how to distract her with silly stories when she was too tired to keep her eyes open. And slowly, something changed. Sarah softened. She still kept her distance, still protected herself. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where Jack saw something other than anger in her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe he had changed. Days turned into weeks, and Jack became a fixture in Sophie's life. He read to her at night, learned how she liked her stuffed animals arranged. He even let her paint his nails one afternoon, much to the amusement of the nurses. One evening, as he tucked the blankets around her, Sophie looked up at him with those big, dark eyes and asked, "Are you going to leave?" Jack felt his throat tighten. This wasn't just a casual question. This was a child who had lived her whole life without a father. A child who knew what it was like to be left behind. Jack leaned in, his voice steady. "No, sweetheart, I'm not going anywhere." Sophie studied him, her small fingers clutching the edge of the blanket. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, "Okay." Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Because that single word meant she believed him. Jack had spent the past few weeks doing something he never thought possible, learning to be a father. Sophie was recovering well, her small frame growing stronger by the day. Jack had learned how to braid her hair, badly, how to make her laugh when she was feeling down, and how to read her favorite bedtime story without skipping a single word. But most importantly, he had learned how to love her. And Sophie? She was beginning to love him back. She reached for his hand when she was scared. She waited for him to arrive every morning with sleepy eyes and a hopeful smile. And at night, when she thought no one was listening, she whispered, "Good night, Daddy," to the shadows before falling asleep. Jack's heart swelled every time he heard it. For the first time in his life, his success wasn't measured in money or power. It was measured in bedtime stories, small hands clinging to his, and the sound of his daughter's laughter filling the hospital room. But just when Jack thought he was finally moving forward, his past came back to drag him down. Jack had just stepped out of Sophie's hospital room when he saw her. Melissa, standing in the hallway, waiting. Her sharp blue eyes scanned him, her arms crossed tightly over her expensive designer dress. Even here, in a hospital, she looked like she belonged on a magazine cover, perfect, untouchable, and as cold as ice. Jack's stomach twisted. He knew this was coming. Melissa had always hated losing, and she had just lost him. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Jack muttered, his voice laced with exhaustion. Melissa tilted her head, feigning innocence. "I had to see it with my own eyes." Jack Thompson, the ruthless, heartless CEO, reduced to playing house in a hospital. Jack clenched his jaw. "What do you want, Melissa?" Her red lips curled into a smirk. "I want you to stop this ridiculous act and come home." Jack stiffened. "This is my home now." Melissa let out a laugh, a cruel sound echoing down the empty hallway. "Oh, please, do you really think this is where you belong? With a woman who hates you and a child who barely knows you?" Jack's hands curled into fists. "She's my daughter." Melissa's smirk faltered for just a moment. Then, in a voice laced with venom, she whispered, "She survived without you for years. She doesn't need you now." Jack's heart clenched, because deep down, a part of him feared she was right. Melissa took a slow step toward him, placing a delicate hand on his chest. "Come back to New York with me. Jack, the board is losing faith in you. Your investors are worried. This little distraction is ruining everything you built." Jack stared at her, barely hearing her words. A few months ago, he would have listened. A few months ago, he would have agreed. His company had been his entire life. Power had been his obsession. But now, his world was in that hospital room. His world had dark brown eyes and a tiny giggle. His world called him Daddy. Jack exhaled sharply. "Melissa, I don't want to be that man anymore." Her expression darkened. "You don't have a choice. If you don't come back, the company will fall apart." Jack's jaw tightened, then let it. Melissa gasped. "You can't mean that." But Jack only nodded. "For the first time in my life, I have something that matters more than money, more than power, and I'll be damned if I let you take it from me." Melissa stared at him, her perfect mask finally cracking. Jack had made his choice. And it wasn't her. It had never been her. Without another word, Melissa turned on her heel and stormed away, her heels clicking against the cold hospital floor. Jack watched her go, feeling nothing but relief. His past was finally behind him, and he was never looking back. Jack stepped back into Sophie's hospital room, but Sarah was already there, sitting in the chair beside their daughter's bed. She didn't look up when he entered, but he could feel the tension in the air. She had heard everything. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Sarah, she's right, isn't she?" Sarah interrupted, her voice quiet but sharp. "You're giving up everything, your company, your entire life, for us." Jack hesitated, not because he doubted his decision, but because he could hear the fear in Sarah's voice. She didn't trust him, not yet. Jack took a deep breath and stepped closer. "I spent my whole life chasing the wrong things. Sarah, power, money, status. And for what? To end up alone in a penthouse with no one to share it with?" Sarah's eyes flickered, but she remained silent. Jack exhaled. "I don't regret choosing Sophie. I don't regret choosing you. I regret every second I wasted before now." A long silence filled the room. Jack waited, prayed, and then, finally, Sarah looked up at him. Her green eyes were filled with uncertainty. But there was something else there too. Hope. "Then prove it," she whispered. Jack's chest tightened. "I will. And this time, he meant it." Jack had spent weeks by Sophie's side, watching her slowly recover, feeling his heart swell with every little victory, her first steps outside the hospital bed. Her bright smile when she beat him at a board game, the way she clung to him when she was scared. For the first time in his life, he had purpose beyond boardrooms and profit margins. For the first time, he felt like a father. But life had a cruel way of testing people when they least expected it. And that test came in the dead of night, when Jack was jolted awake by the shrill sound of hospital alarms. Jack had fallen asleep in the chair beside Sophie's hospital bed, her tiny fingers still curled around his. He was exhausted, but he refused to leave her alone. So when the machines started beeping, when nurses and doctors rushed in, pushing him aside, his heart stopped. "Sophie?" Jack's voice was raw as he struggled to stay on his feet. She was convulsing. Her tiny body, once warm and full of life, was now trembling violently. Her face was pale, lips tinged blue. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was now erratic, screaming in the room like a cruel warning. Jack's hands clenched into fists. "Do something," he roared, his voice breaking with desperation. The doctors barely spared him a glance as they worked frantically. "Her oxygen levels are dropping. We need to stabilize her now." Jack tried to move forward, but Sarah grabbed his arm, holding him back. "Jack, let them work," she whispered, her own voice trembling, but Jack could feel her shaking. He knew she was just as terrified as he was. They could only watch, helpless. And Jack had never felt this powerless before in his life. Minutes felt like hours. Jack stood frozen as the doctors fought to bring Sophie back. He could barely breathe, barely think. All he knew was that he couldn't lose her. Not now. Not after everything. "Come on, baby, please stay with us," Jack whispered, his vision blurring as his chest tightened. Sarah's grip on his arm tightened, her silent sobs shaking through her body. The machines kept beeping. The tension in the room was suffocating. And then, silence. Jack's breath hitched. The beeping had stopped. No, 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 no. He felt his entire world collapse. But then, a soft gasp. Jack's head snapped up. The doctors exhaled in relief. "She's stabilizing. We got her back." Jack nearly collapsed from the weight of his relief, his legs giving out beneath him. Sarah caught him before he could fall, both of them clinging to each other, shaking, crying, overwhelmed. Sophie was alive, but she had come so close to slipping away. And Jack knew then, he could never take a second with her for granted again. The next morning, Jack sat in the doctor's office, his fingers tightly laced together. Sarah sat beside him, her face pale and drawn. Neither of them had slept. The doctor sighed, flipping through Sophie's file before meeting Jack's gaze. "She made it through the night," he said gently, "but she's not out of the woods yet. Her heart is still weak. The surgery saved her, but she needs time to recover." Jack's jaw clenched. "What does that mean? What do we do?" The doctor hesitated. "It means she's still fragile. A single infection, a single complication." His voice trailed off, but Jack understood the implication. Jack exhaled sharply, his hands trembling. He had never been this scared. Not in all his years of high-stakes business deals. Not in the face of losing millions. Not even when his empire had been on the verge of collapse. None of that compared to this fear, the fear of losing his daughter. Sarah's hand slipped into his. He looked at her, seeing his own fear reflected in her eyes. But there was also determination. "We won't let that happen," she whispered. "She's going to get through this." Jack nodded, his throat tight, because failure wasn't an option. Not this time. That night, Jack sat beside Sophie's bed, watching her sleep. Her small chest rose and fell in gentle, even breaths. She looked so peaceful, and all he could think about was how close he had come to losing her. Jack took her tiny hand in his, pressing a gentle kiss to her fingers. "I wasn't there for the first years of your life, Sophie, but I swear to you, I'll be here for every single one from now on." His voice cracked. "I love you, baby girl, more than anything in this world." Sophie stirred slightly, her little hand squeezing his fingers in her sleep. Jack felt his heart clench. He had almost lost her. But she had fought, and so would he, no matter what it took. No matter how hard the road ahead was. Jack Thompson wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a father, and he was never letting go again. The world outside had barely changed, But for Jack Thompson, everything had. Months had passed since Sophie's near-death experience. And though the fear still lingered in his heart, the weight of loss no longer defined him. Instead, love did. For the first time in his life, Jack was truly living, not for power, not for money, not for status, but for his daughter. And that changed everything. Jack no longer chased after deals like a starving man. He no longer spent his nights in the cold, empty silence of his penthouse, drowning his regrets in whiskey. Instead, his nights were spent reading bedtime stories, braiding Sophie's hair, and listening to her soft, sleepy voice tell him about her dreams. His empire? He still had it, but it was no longer his obsession. Instead of fighting to expand it, Jack made a choice that shocked everyone who knew him. He stepped down. Jack had built his company with ruthless ambition, crushing anything that stood in his way. But now, as he sat in the boardroom for the final time, staring at the massive company he once thought defined him, he realized it didn't. Success wasn't power. Success wasn't wealth. Success was love. It was waking up every morning and knowing Sophie would be there, smiling up at him. It was watching Sarah and Sophie paint together, their laughter filling the home he never knew he needed. It was being present, being the father he had once refused to be. Jack exhaled, signing the papers to transfer ownership. "I thought this company was my greatest achievement," he said to the board members. "But I was wrong." The men and women in the room exchanged glances, confused. Jack had spent years fighting to be on top, and now he was walking away willingly? "I have something far more important now," he continued, a small smile playing on his lips. With that, he stood up, buttoned his suit, and left the boardroom for the last time. No regrets, only hope. Sophie's laughter rang through the air as Jack carried her on his shoulders. Her small hands tangled in his hair. "Faster, Daddy, you're so slow," she giggled. Jack chuckled. He used to think Daddy was a title he'd never deserve. Now, it was his greatest honor. Sarah watched them from the porch, her arms crossed, shaking her head in amusement. "She's got you wrapped around her little finger." Jack smirked. "She's earned it." The setting sun bathed the world in gold. And as Jack looked at his family, a deep peace settled in his chest. He finally understood. Money came and went. Power faded. But love? Love was forever. Jack didn't just walk away from his empire. He used his fortune to create something better. He funded a foundation for children with heart conditions, ensuring that families like his never had to go through what Sophie did. He built schools, invested in medical research, and dedicated his life to helping others. And through it all, Sophie was by his side, her tiny hand in his, her heart beating strong and steady. "You're doing something amazing, Jack," Sarah said one evening as they watched Sophie run through the garden. Jack exhaled, looking at the place where his past mistakes had once defined him. Now, they were just part of his journey. And he was finally free. The penthouse was long gone. Jack moved into a warm, sunlit home where laughter echoed in every room, where Sophie painted her dreams on the walls, where Sarah read in the kitchen, her presence a quiet, steady comfort. Jack wasn't the same man who had abandoned his family. He was better. He had learned, he had fought, and he had won. Not the way he used to, with ruthless deals and power plays, but with love, redemption, and sacrifice. And for the first time in his life, he was truly happy. Jack Thompson had everything: power, wealth, and success. But none of it made him happy. None of it could replace the love he had thrown away. He had to lose everything to realize what truly mattered. And in the end, his greatest victory wasn't wealth, it was becoming the father Sophie needed. So ask yourself, what is your definition of success? Is it power? Is it money? Or is it the people who love you? If you believe that love is the greatest success, hit like, comment, family first, if this story touched your heart. Subscribe now so you never miss another powerful story. Because in the end, love is the only thing that truly lasts.